Okay, today is going to be on chapter 7, but we have a bit of an advantage here where instead of doing 3 chapters a week, we're only doing 2 chapters a week. And since we have 4 lectures, I'll only be covering the first half of chapter 7 today, which is the conveniently split up because we're talking about both cognitive and physical development in children in the pre-operational stage. So we're talking about maybe up to about the age of 7, and then for tomorrow I'll be talking about the cognitive development. Now, I did have a concern addressed. Somebody mentioned that they wanted to have more of the lectures up front so that they could dedicate more time in the beginning of the week to it instead of the end of the week to it. Well, initially I didn't want to do this because I really don't want people to put off all their work until the end of the week. We already had a couple of people that basically kind of messed over their entire discussion group because they waited until Saturday to do the discussion, and then now nobody can respond to anything that they say because the thing is closed and it's all over. So so I really want to encourage people to kind of put this in on a daily basis. The summer courses, because they're so short, really aren't as much of an at my convenience thing as an online course for a normal semester because we just don't have a lot of time here. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll on Monday, like today, I will go ahead and record 2 lectures. One of them I'll put up. I'll put both of them up on the YouTube channel I've been using, and I'll put one of them up on every day. I'll continue to upload one to Angel. And then on Wednesday, I'll do the same thing. So if you really can't make it on a Thursday, you can at least see the lecture uh, on YouTube, even if it won't be on Angel until Thursday. The reason I do want to discourage this, though, unless you absolutely have to, is because if this were a course with the short amount of time that we have, if this were a course that were all lecture, in class like normal, we would be meeting 5 days a week, 2 hours a day. In order to cover, we're actually legally required to have so many hours of work in order to have accreditation as a university and as a class, so that basically anybody outside of this class will take this course seriously. We have to have so many hours that you have to put into it. So if you miss a day, if you take Thursday off, or if you take Wednesday off, or something like that, well, now you're up to about 4 hours that you have to dedicate on a different day. So you should be listening to this lecture. You should be reading for about an hour. Doing some studying, and then any of the other work that I put in front of you, like the discussions and that sort of stuff. And so that's a good 2 hours a day. If you wait a day, you're going to have a tendency to kind of skim through things. And as you notice from the last test, these are not easy tests. The depth of knowledge is pretty intense, and if you put things off, you're probably going to fail, quite honestly. And it'll probably be because you put everything off till the last minute. This is just not something where you can cram at just the last minute. You have to kind of study the entire time. So while I'll make it available in case you have vacations, I mean, things come up. I would encourage you not to take too much advantage of it. Okay, so we're talking about early childhood here, the physical and cognitive development. We'll go physical today. The Normally I've been avoiding the physical aspect, and that's because we were doing, kind of prenatal physical development. And that really, if it does affect the psychological capacity, we have no idea because we don't know either the behaviors or the thoughts of babies. We can do the babies just a little bit, but their cognitive development is really the important part here. And of course, I did stress the physical development of babies a little bit more when they do certain milestones, that sort of stuff. One of the things that I do want to mention is I'll go over some new stuff here. On page 167, they talk about the dominant cerebral hemisphere. And a lot of people are familiar with brain lateralization. We covered this in the baby physical development part. And there is a dominant cerebral hemisphere, the cerebrum being the thinky part of the brain, the part that's bigger on humans than any other animal. When you actually study the brain development, it's interesting because the brain actually grows in layers like an onion, and the more, you can't say more evolved because we're all evolved the same, but the more developed a creature is, it basically keeps the same brain that it had. I mentioned that we'll have ties to evolution in during the entire semester. It keeps the same brain that ancestors had, but then it adds another layer on top. So at the very beginning, you have just like, say, a fish that just has a hindbrain. It just has a very basic nerve net. It doesn't really have much else to deal with. And then the fish and amphibians basically have about the same brains, and then you have reptiles. So there's another part on top of the hindbrain, which is basically just like the hindbrain is like a little stick. It's hardly anything at all. But this is actually called the reptilian brain, and this is where emotions first started to kick in. By the way, sex, power, anger. Fish can't get angry. They literally do not have the physical part of their brain that is responsible for even the most basic and primitive of emotions. Oddly enough, fish can't feel pain either, nor can amphibians. They do not have the pain response is in the reptilian part of the brain. Not that I'm encouraging you to go around and torture fish and frogs, but the pain is a non-response. They have a negative reaction to negative stimuli, just as a survival instinct, but pain is something that's completely foreign to them. So then you have this reptilian complex on top of the hindbrain, and then on top of that you have a mammalian. For mammals, we then evolved another part of the brain, and it's actually a small little cerebral cortex on there. So we can get some very complicated emotions as mammals. Your lizard can't love you, or it can want to have sex with you. It can be angry at you. But other than the very basic, very primal emotions of say, sex and power, they're not going to have anything because they're just not mammals. And then mammals are going to have a lot more emotions, a lot more social development, and then we have the primate brain, and then humans have, which has a huge cerebral cortex. So there's possibility of thought in there, a lot more development of emotions, and humans have just like a huge amount of cerebral cortex, even compared to the other primates. I know we love to talk about how intelligent chimpanzees are, and they are compared to animals, but not really compared to humans. They just don't have the massive cerebral cortex that we have. And this is something that's huge in the physical development of children, because it's all based around this. And so emotions, but keep in mind, evolutionarily speaking, we are barely out of the tree. It is quite possible that there's a lower group of humans that can't think, that can't really experience the full range of emotions like some of the rest of us do, because evolutionarily we have just started upon this path. And so we have this, so a lot of people know about the physical development of the brain here, and they know that there's a brain lateralization, the fact that the brain is responsible on one half for one thing and another half for something else. And they go over this a little bit in the book, so I'm not going to rehash too much of what they talk about. They speak of it very well. But they do kind of overplay the dominant hemisphere in regards to its connection with some other things. To read the book, you would be under the assumption that left-handed people have opposite brains. Most of the time, for example, the logical processes are in the left half of the brain, and the more emotional or creative aspects are in the right half of the brain. And they kind of lead you to believe in the book that this is the opposite in left-handed people. And it is a tendency to be opposite in left-handed people, but it's just kind of, it's not that big of an effect. In general, it is true that about 10% of the population is left-handed, and 10% of the people have opposite brain lateralization. But those two aren't 100% connected. There's a bit of overlap, but it's definitely not 100%. One of the things they don't mention in the book for the new stuff here is that perceptions are also brain lateralized. So I'm going to go ahead right now, and I'm going to show you a picture. See if I can test out this mixing pictures with video. I'm going to show you a picture, and what I want you to do is I want you to look at this and tell me, and I'll only show it for a few seconds, so just look at this picture and tell me if the person is happy or sad. Or rather, instead of finding out whether or not it's happy or sad, there's going to be two images here. Um, which one is happier? The one on the right or the one on the left? And you only have about 5 seconds to see. Now, as you'll probably notice, they're both the same picture, just one flipped around the other side. And but while looking at them, one will give an impression of being happier and the other one will give an impression of being sadder. And that is because it's not just our brains that are lateralized as far as how we think, but it's also how we perceive the world. So we will look for one particular side of the face when we look at emotion. Because there's one particular part of the brain that's going to be looking for emotion. So when you're looking for happiness or sadness, you're going to be, so for example, a lot of people who are going to have right lateralization when it comes to emotion, they're going to be perceiving their emotions with the right part of the brain, which is going to transfer over to the left eye, and the left eye will see the left side of the brain. So whichever one is the left, so that would wind up being the leftmost image, whatever that sees. If the left side of your face is happy, you will seem happy. If the right side of your face is unhappy, then you'll seem unhappy. Interestingly enough, because the other side of the brain isn't doing emotion, it's doing kind of logical processing. People lie with about half their face, and they detect with about half their face. So one of the ways that they've used to kind of test lying is, I might have mentioned that it's kind of the micro movements of the face that do any sort of lie detection, and it's because the movements of the face differ from one side to the other. Kids, for example, horrible liars. They just haven't learned to control the different aspects of their face yet. So the brain lateralization is a lot more than just whether or not you're left or right-handed. It's how you think, it's how you see the world. So people who are going to have a different, not necessarily left-handed, but people who have different brain lateralization are going to perceive the world differently. They're going to see some people as emotional, where the rest of us will see them as insincere, because they're looking at a different part of their brain in order to determine these things. Another thing that they do is they check out critical periods. They talk about that in the book, and this is a very important part. There's something called the mere exposure effect. And this means that the more often you see something or experience it, the more you like it. And this is a little counterintuitive to how the different cliches we have in our particular culture. We like to say that we get tired of something, blah, blah, blah. It's actually just kind of not true. They did an experiment where they showed people 100 random pictures, and some of the pictures were repeated. And the whole goal was to rate them on a scale of 1 to 10 on how much you liked them. And they were all just general scenic pictures. They basically all looked the same. And so you would rate them on a scale of 1 to 10. And some of the pictures were repeated. And the ones that were repeated, the more often they were repeated, the higher rating they would get every single time. We just like things that we experience more often. And this is seen in child development with tastes, the different tastes that you get. Has anybody ever wondered why you have to have an acquired taste for beer? It's because beer doesn't taste good for most people. There are a few people who love to talk about how they are the exception. Whenever you mention that beer doesn't taste good, there's always one guy in the crowd that will just love to tell you how he thought beer tasted good right the first time. But for the rest of humanity, beer doesn't taste that good, and you have to drink it for a while until you get good at it. You have to let this mere exposure effect make you put up with the taste of alcohol. We have a natural revulsion because it's a poison. That's why it does liver damage, because your liver filters out poisons. And it's the same with coffee and cigarettes and all this stuff. Most people hate this, so we have to build up a tolerance for it. Have you ever went to a different food, have like Ethiopian food, which is notoriously spicy, or Korean food, which has things like kimchi in it, and everything tastes like the same bland, or you can't say bland because it's hot, but the same just red pepper paste. Almost all their foods, to me, taste like red pepper paste. But somebody from that culture loves this food, just like we like, fried chicken and hamburgers. Somebody else eats fried chicken and hamburger, and they're like, the grease. You could put up with this? Yes, we got used to it. So if you ever wonder why your child might be really, really picky, I can give you advice for those of you that don't have children. By all means, there are some people who are naturally predisposed to be more or less picky. They're biologically going to have different tastes than other people. But the more you get them used to it at a very critical age, when they're very, very tiny, when they're just starting out on new food, get them used to tons of new food. And trust me, they will be much, much more likely to want to try more foods, to ultimately be healthier, because they won't avoid vegetables. They won't avoid new foods. They'll have this kind of healthy attitude on trying new things because they develop those tastes at this critical period. And that's very physical. You are physically developed to, just like the Harlow monkeys, where the babies were predisposed to be able to develop attachment at a particular age, you're able to develop a healthy taste for new foods at a particular age. And this is very cultural, what sort of foods that you have. So don't just give your babies hot dogs and Cheerios because that's what they like. Give them everything, and continue to give them that, and they'll be much healthier for it. I did want to mention they have a little immunization thing in there. I hate the fact that I even have to say this, but I do. Immunizations are good. It's silly for a scientist to say it. There was a rumor going around about 15 years ago, and I think an adult film star got really popular and started talking about how vaccinations and immunizations cause autism. And oddly enough, the report they were basing everything off was found to be inaccurate like 2 months after it was printed, and they retracted it. It's no longer in print. But man, people just went with it because they wanted something to blame for autism. Autism is kind of a big thing, and it is a fad. You will find in psychology that there are psychological fads, things that are just incredibly overdiagnosed because we kind of look for problems. And in our culture, we even kind of define people on the problems that they have. You'll look to people and say, okay, well, that's Mary. She's diabetic, and that's Sally. She's autistic, and that's Paul. He has PTSD, and we kind of define people on what's wrong with them, and it's kind of a horrible practice, but it's what we do. And so for a long in the 80s, for example, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They didn't call it that whole thing back then. They've had different names for it, but that was all the rage. Everybody had ADD, and nowadays it's PTSD. Everybody has post-traumatic stress disorder, and people will have post-traumatic stress disorder about things that are relatively small in some cases. It's like you handled any situation in your life as, perhaps not the best is how you handled this situation, and it can be anything from, I was made fun of as a child to, I went through wartime, or my father yelled at me too much or didn't hug me enough or something like that, and they'll be diagnosed with PTSD. And autism is another thing that is horribly diagnosed. However, at the same time, autism is kind of a big deal. Physiologically, there are more people being born with autism than at any other point in history. So we're really trying. So even though there is an overdiagnosing aspect of it, there is also like a real issue here that we have to look at. And so people are just scrambling and they're panicking, and so they blame vaccinations, and that's a shame. I'll be honest with you. We have not found any sort of biological component for autism, nor have we found any sort of psychological component for autism. There is no discernible pattern that has been found, and there is tons of grant money going for this. They're really looking. There's just no pattern found to who's being born with autism and who isn't. Most likely, we will never find a pattern. This happens evolutionarily. Sometimes we hit what George Carlin referred to as an evolutionary cul-de-sac, where a certain biological trait that has been unnoticeable up until now because it didn't matter up until now, because of a new environment that we're in, is affecting us badly. Only the people that have that particular trait. So let's say, you had this, gene 238, and up until now it just made it so that you didn't like salty foods as much as somebody else, and that's really no big deal, so the trait survived just fine. But gene 238, in the presence of, say, small amounts of Teflon in your diet, because we've used Teflon a lot in the last 20 or 30 years. So in the presence of Teflon in your diet, gene 238 will give you a higher likelihood of autism. And up until now, like I said, gene 238 has been fine, and now gene 238 combined with Teflon is going to make you autistic. So we're never going to find the connection between autism and, say, in this case, the Teflon. But at the same time, it will kind of work itself out evolutionarily. These people won't have as many children. Gene 238 will get less and less prevalent in the population, and in 40 years, we'll have as many autistic people as we had 40 years ago. Because it could be anything. There's so many things that are new in the environment. It could be Teflon. It could be the cell phone that you're probably looking at right now while listening to me. It could be wireless signals. It could be the fact that we're using fiber optics in our phone lines. It could be anything, and there's no way we'll ever find a connection. So don't be too scared when people start screaming about vaccinations. It's just a bunch of panic mongers using outdated and almost immediately disproven information. The last thing that I do want to cover is, I was mentioning some of these different psychological fads, and people are very resistant to calling these psychological fads. It's very popular in pop psychology. You can read Psychology Today, which is basically like USA Today for people who are interested in psychology. A little sketchy on the information front, and they'll really discredit the idea of trying to talk about these things as fads. But the fact of the matter is there have always been psychological fads. There was a trend, I believe it was in the 40s, where they found, we're going through the physiological aspects of the brain right now. One of the things that they don't mention in the book is the amygdala. Now, they found that the amygdala is the center of a lot of emotions, and a lot of the primitive emotions that children experience. So, for example, they did some testing. They had some in the laboratory. They had some really angry monkeys, and these were just horrible monkeys. They bit. They threw things. They attacked. They were in a laboratory. They probably weren't being treated that well. Especially this was in the 40s. They didn't really have a lot of animal control groups or ethics. But they're just very angry monkeys, so they're like, okay, we can't do anything with these monkeys. They're too difficult to deal with. So let's do some experiments and see if we can make them easier to deal with. And one of the things that they did was they did some surgery on the brain, and they severed the ties to the amygdala. And they did a whole bunch of other things, but among other things, they severed the ties to the amygdala on one group of monkeys, and man, they became easy to deal with. They weren't angry anymore. They weren't yelling. They weren't fighting. It was great. There were a couple of side effects. While they were very placid, they were also hypersexual, oddly enough, and so they would just try to have sex with everything at this point. And at the same time, they lost their source of disgust. I mentioned previously that disgust was an evolutionary thing. We have a real reason for disgust, and apparently it's stored in the amygdala because these monkeys lost all semblance of disgust, which combined with a hyperactive sex drive led to some kind of gross things. They would not disregard their own feces anymore. Most animals will kind of stay away from their own feces. A ferret will crap in the corner. A cat will take a dump and then try to cover it up to try to keep the germs down. Mammals will usually have an area, like primates, these monkeys would have an area they go to the bathroom, like we do. They have a bathroom. But they wouldn't. They'd just take a dump and then probably have sex with it. As far as they were concerned, it was still warm, so that was all good. So they found this, and it was interesting, and a couple of doctors realized that at the time there was something, all these kids were coming in. It was kind of a psychological fad to have basically ADD. They called it other things, like in the 70s they called it hyperkinetic, and they called it something different at this particular point before hyperkinetic. Essentially, these were just difficult to deal with children, and so they said, you know what? We have a new procedure we can do. We can just sever the ties to the amygdala. They'll become really easy to get along with. This was the origin of the frontal lobotomy, by the way, and this was done to hundreds of thousands of children who were simply diagnosed with being difficult to get along with. And it's a lot different than you think. It was an outpatient procedure. Again, I get into the ethics of psychology a little bit. The ethics are not paying attention to the proper things. It was an outpatient procedure. You would actually give them a frontal lobotomy with a butter knife. There would be no anesthesia. You would literally go in under the eye, past the optic nerve, wiggle it around a little bit, sever a little bit of the brain, do it to the other side. Excruciatingly painful for the child, but it only took about 5 minutes, so they considered that kind of fine. And they said, don't even explain it to the child. One of the quotes was, instead of giving them an explanation, give them a pair of dark glasses, because their eyes are going to be bruised for a few days. And this was common practice. I mentioned this as a warning. Don't fall for the fads too much. A lot of the fads, like the anti-vaccination thing, like the frontal lobotomies for kids who are a little hyperactive, these, while they're a little bit based on science, they're also based on not understanding the science completely, and reports from people who flat out aren't scientists. So listen to the scientists; they know what they're talking about. Completely discredit the journalists. And when I say scientist, I'm not referring to every psychologist. I'm not referring to clinical psychologists. I'm certainly not referring to social workers. I'm not referring to nurses. I am talking about people who do the science, the articles that you read. So I'll go over the cognitive aspects next time. In addition, I'll also start to go over the first paper, because that'll be due in a couple of weeks, so we can go ahead and get started on that.